into week 6 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few defenses I looked at on the waiver wire this week. The first one is the Indianapolis Colts. So the Colts have a good matchup in week 6 versus division foe, the Houston Texans. And the Colts here, I know they're not the greatest of defenses, but they're still a pretty solid unit. I know I said to drop them heading into week 5 last week because of the matchup with the Baltimore Ravens. So right here, week 6 versus Houston, it's a 1 week ad in my opinion. The Colts, they're available in 57% of fantasy leagues. And we know Houston gives up the 5th most fantasy points to defenses, even though the New England Patriots in week 5 didn't do much as a DST unit versus the Houston Texans. But I think the Colts can make a few plays and get things going in week 6 here versus the Houston team. And they're definitely an ad this week on the wire. The next defense I've looked at this week's the Green Bay Packers. So the Packers here, they played pretty decent defense in week 5 versus the Cincinnati Bengals. 3 sacks, 2 interceptions, 22 points allowed. Now they got a good matchup here week 6 at the Chicago Bears, where the Bears, we know they're a little offensively challenged with Justin Fields and some of the injuries to David Montgomery and a couple offensive linemen. So right here, the Bears give up the 4th most fantasy points to DSTs this season. And this Packer team, they're a pretty solid unit with the Smiths on the defensive line. Also wearing Jalen Smith as well. And I know Jair Alexander's banged up, but this Green Bay Packer unit, like I mentioned, still can make some plays. And this season, they've scored 10, 7, 11, and 7 fantasy points in the first 5 weeks of the season. So right here, the next 2 weeks, good matchups in week 6 at Chicago and week 7 versus the Washington football team. And right now, this Packer DST is available in 76% of fantasy leagues. The next defense I looked at on the wire this week's the Miami Dolphins. So they're another defense that I think are a 1 week thing here. They got a good matchup with the Jacksonville Jaguars that give up the 9th most fantasy points to DSTs. And this ball game's in London, so anything goes down there in London. We saw a pretty good game versus the Jets and the Atlanta Falcons in London. So right here, this Dolphin team, they've been in shambles this season though. Ever since week 1, they're now 1-4 on the season. And they need this defense to step up and make a few plays. And I think Trevor Lawrence is a good player for Jacksonville, obviously. But also, he's a guy that's good for a turnover or two as well in this ball game, even though I still think he has a good fantasy day versus Miami. But this Dolphin unit, if they want to have chances to win ball games, they're going to have to rely on their defense and their running game, in my opinion. And right here, I think they're a decent ad, and they're available in 85% of fantasy leagues. The next defense is the Kansas City Chiefs. So the Chiefs got a good matchup at the Washington football team. And I know the Chiefs have struggled this season on defense. But right here, it's another 1 week ad, in my opinion, at the Washington football team here for Kansas City. We know Taylor Heineke, he's been pretty decent, but he's also a player that's prone to turnovers as well here for this offense in Washington. And their receivers, besides Terry McLaurin, haven't done much this season. I think Kansas City, they're going to get off to a big lead in that ball game in Washington and make them one-dimensional in that game. So right here, they're available in 58% of fantasy leagues. And as a 1 week ad, I like them this week, is Kansas City. And the 5th and final DST I looked at this week's the Dallas Cowboys. So the Cowboys had a pretty decent ball game versus the New York Giants. And this Cowboy team, they do give up a decent amount of points. But this season, it's a totally different thing here. This Cowboy defense does get stops. They do get turnovers. And versus the Giants, in week 5, they had 20 points allowed, 2 interceptions, including a pick 6 by Anthony Brown. Even though that ball game was out of reach there, he padded on the stats. And we even saw him in week 4 versus Carolina. They gave up 28 points, but they had 5 sacks and 2 interceptions. So right here versus the rookie Mac Jones in week 6 in New England, I think they could have a decent day as this Dallas defense. And the Patriots give up the 8th most fantasy points to DST, so that's a few DST defenses I look to add here on the waiver wire heading into week 6 of the fantasy football season.